This is Kyle Cleveland with Temple University Japan's iCast, a new podcast through the Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. I'm here this evening with Dave Maass. Dave is a former study abroad student at Temple University in Japan. He was here around the year 2000 and subsequently has become involved in issues related to public surveillance, human rights, information disclosure. Dave, you're involved with this Electronic Frontier organization. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I have worked at the Electronic Frontier Foundation in San Francisco since about 2013. I started there a few months before Edward Snowden started releasing documents, and so it was a very exciting time. If you haven't heard about EFF, we were formed in 1990 to work on issues related to civil liberties as society advances with technology. So we have a team of lawyers, a team of technologists, a team of activists who work on issues related to law enforcement surveillance, surveillance by intelligence agencies, but also issues related to copyright reform, freedom of information, censorship, and social media companies and how they collect our data. So it's a wide variety of issues that all function at the intersection of society and technology.
So how did you get involved in this field?
So after I graduated from TUJ back in around 2000, I went into a career of journalism. So a lot of investigative reporting, mostly for alternative newspapers along the U.S.-Mexico border. So in Phoenix and Santa Fe. So in states that had that kind of intersection. And I worked on a lot of criminal justice issues, but I was also very interested in technology. And those were kind of separate parallel paths in my life, being very interested in technology and internet and video cameras were getting smaller, looking at online communities. And that was kind of like just one portion of my life. And then on the other, I would do a lot of investigative reporting around death row in Texas or jail systems and over policing in San Diego, California. And then, around 2012, 2013, I was looking for a change in careers. I wanted to move from journalism to the nonprofit sector. And there was this organization, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, that I've been watching for many years. Basically after 9/11, they started working on issues related to mass surveillance by the intelligence agencies in the United States. And they had a job opening that met my qualifications. And so I was able to merge that technology track in my life and the investigative reporting track in my life to focus on issues related to surveillance, freedom of information, and censorship at EFF. And so I've been doing that for about 8 years or so. And over the last 2 years, we've expanded, or at least I've expanded my work with EFF into a partnership with the journalism school at the University of Nevada, Reno, where I'm working with, a massive amount of students, actually, more than 150 students each semester on this large-scale research project into police surveillance technology across the United States.
So when you got started in these issues, I think you're a film and media studies student, as I recall, at Temple University. And was 2001 the real pivot point in this? Because certainly we're in a different place today than we were when you were graduating as a student.
Absolutely. I think, when I was at TUJ in 99 and 2000, we were starting to see a shift with technology in that, we were all on AOL Instant Messenger, and that was a brand new thing. I think I got my first cell phone when I was in Tokyo, and we were blown away by the ability to text message each other, because before that, it was like pagers. You were starting to see, chat rooms and online communities, and people were getting their news from, online sources. And you had this thing called Google that was just, what is this? You put in a word and it will return information from around the world. What is this? It's crazy. And so we'd already started to have a shift in how society worked with technology. But then, 9/11 happened, and the way that the government viewed technology shifted quite a bit. And priorities in the country, or globally even shifted. And we started seeing, authoritarian shifts in the idea of surveilling everyone all the time in case somebody is going to do something bad, like, execute a terrorist attack. And from that point on, you saw money flowing in to the intelligence agencies, to domestic law enforcement agencies, all the way down to local law enforcement entities who are all just gathering more data on everyone all the time. And we've consistently seen that while the rhetoric has often been around terrorism and terrorist groups, really this technology trickles down to the lowest level crimes, people who are accused of misusing food stamps, or people who have are late on paying a court fine. It really does shift in society over time from tackling these larger issues that people are really concerned about down to these low level issues that impact communities of color in the United States more than they do, say, white affluent communities.
So it really has become all encompassing, I guess. I recall that just after the 2001 terrorist attacks, I don't know who it was probably someone in President Bush's administration who eventually became involved with Homeland Security, who in response to criticism of government imposition in people's lives, who said, hey, there was a before a terrorist attack in 2001 and there's after, and after the gloves come off. And of course, that led eventually to the second Gulf invasion by the United States into Iraq. But clearly there was government surveillance and there was state secrecy and public intelligence, government intelligence prior to that. So it's a paradigm shift, I guess, that coincides with the rise of social media. But how do you demarcate the difference between before that era of social media and thereafter?
So it's interesting. I think you're right in that it's not, novel for the government to try to conduct mass surveillance, whether that was, back in the day, monitoring the telegraph lines, or the types of horrendous surveillance and manipulation that the federal government exercised against Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in the 60s. I think one of the big differences is that people are just engaging so much more on social media. They're sharing so much more about their lives. It's not just where they're shopping, but they might engage in, worshiping religion online. They may be organizing labor movements online. They may be doing all sorts of activities related to free expression and freedom of religion and the freedom to organize online. But beyond that, they are looking up health conditions. They are getting information about relationships. They are learning how to get out of domestic abuse situations. They are looking for new jobs. The massive amount of information that we're sharing online leaves this digital trail that we're not necessarily aware of. And so from the government perspective, they have moved into this period of, instead of being very narrowly targeting people based on investigations, the idea is to collect information on everyone all of the time, to have the entire population under surveillance. And that has a lot of ramifications. I think in the past, we have talked about these issues related to surveillance in a very individual capacity. We are thinking about, what is my civil rights? What is my freedom of expression? What is my freedom to worship? How does it impact me? And that results in a lot of people saying, well, if I have nothing to hide, then I have nothing to worry about, because maybe you're somebody who doesn't really care about freedom of speech because you don't speak up very often and you aren't involved in anything controversial. You're just minding your own business. But what we're looking at now is, it doesn't matter if you're engaged in anything controversial because companies are mining data and trying to exploit that. But then even when we're looking at governments, they're not necessarily focused anymore on, they still do have a lot of focus on individuals, but they're starting to broaden to look at how collecting data from society as a whole can be used to manipulate society as a whole, to control society as a whole. And so that's where we're seeing like a massive shift over the last few years. When you look at Cambridge Analytica, when you look at potential Russian manipulation on social media, we are in this period where it's almost like COVID-19. The reason we wear masks isn't necessarily just to protect ourselves from catching coronavirus. It's to protect other people around us as well. And we have to actually shift as a global society to not thinking about privacy as just something individual and just looking at your individual risks, but looking at society's risks.
It's interesting how your scope of interest and the activities you're involved in are so all-encompassing. I guess in part because this kind of public surveillance itself is so all-encompassing that the roads run through every aspect of our lives. Maybe it'd be useful to kind of step back for the audience. I think in some ways a proxy for the audience in the sense that, I'm interested and somewhat marginally aware of these issues, but I don't really know much of the details. Could you just kind of give us a bit of a primer here on how not just the government, but in terms of our use of social media and how that information is coalesced, how it's used, and what the implications of that are?
I can certainly try. I mean, this is a massive topic that even
for sure.
We're learning more and more about every day. So maybe I can approach it from a couple of different directions. So one of the things I focus on is, I primarily focus on law enforcement, the types of things that the police state and government can do to gather information on you. And that overlaps with what happens in the private sector with social media. But let's start with law enforcement. So law enforcement has a whole bunch of tools at its disposal. One of the most common ones in the United States is a technology called automated license plate readers. And these are cameras that police install at traffic lights, on highway overpasses. Maybe they put one by the side of the road on a telephone pole, or they attach it to the top of a police vehicle. So as people are passing by these cameras, the cameras grab a photo of their license plate, attach the time, the date, the location, like the GPS coordinates, and then put that into a database. If a cop has one on their car, as they're driving around, they're collecting that data on all of the vehicles they pass. And they can actually go block by block through a neighborhood, gathering all of the data on a neighborhood about where particular cars are at any given time. Now, this is a physical world thing. This is not social media. This is not anything like that. But it is helpful to understand how this works. Physical world jumps to the digital world. So once law enforcement is collecting this data, and you will have, I think that one of the largest databases of license plate reader data has 10 billion data points going back 5 or more years. So what that means is a law enforcement officer can sit down at a computer, type in a license plate, you say your license plate, and they can get data points on everywhere that you've been seen, your car has been seen potentially years going back. And they can put in the address of a particular location and see what cars have been seen around that location. They can even go in and say, hey, I need to find this person. Where are they usually at 3 o'clock on a Friday? And the computer will try to make a prediction on where this person is going to be. They can also add your license plate to a watch list. So anytime your car is seen by a camera, they get an alert on where you are. And so if you imagine you have a highway with one of these cameras every, quarter of a mile, that means they can track your movement as well, just as good as if they had put a GPS tracker on your car. Now that's, like I said, that's the physical world moving to the digital world. But then, if you take that same concept, you can do that with social media. You can do that with people's online browsing. There are cookies. There are other ways to track people as they're browsing across various things on the internet. And that may feed into a giant database as well. And then police, maybe they can get access to that information. They can purchase access to that information, and they can combine that with the license plate reader data. You have a company called Clearview AI that does face recognition. And what it did is it scraped the entire internet. It grabbed images from every news article, YouTube video, Instagram, LinkedIn, and it created a database of millions and millions and millions of people's images. And then they start selling this technology to cops. And so cops can take a photo of you or grab a photo off a camera that you passed by and use that to find your identity. Because what they're doing is you have this culture of sharing that has developed over decades, where people have faith in the internet. They use it as a way to communicate. They use it as a way to build community. And now that trust is being broken by companies that are exploiting that culture of sharing and selling it to police.
So is there a consolidation of this information? I've read that satellites, for instance, can do what you had mentioned previously with license plate recognition, which is essentially a form of time traveling. You can reverse engineer from a particular crime and track where a given person was going back days, if not longer, everywhere that they had gone and everything that they had done leading up to that. I mean, from a law enforcement point of view, that's obviously very useful information.
Yeah, I often talk about it in those terms, that law enforcement wants to build a time machine. They want to build a way to be able to spin back and see what was happening anywhere at any given time with anyone. Now, I'm sure law enforcement would find that useful. I'm sure law enforcement would find it useful if they were able to place a camera in all of our houses and they were able to record all of our phone calls. I'm sure that would result in them uncovering crimes if they were able to secretly spy on us like that, as if we were talking about East Germany's Stasi or, the way things are going down in China right now. But from my perspective, it's very undemocratic. It is inherently a threat to human rights. It is just not going to result in a free society. It is going to result in a manipulated society, a society that oppresses ethnic minorities and religious minorities, and is designed to enhance the status quo, that is, enforced by the ruling government. And this is a point that I emphasize quite a lot. Law enforcement, police, they're going to make this pitch that this technology is important to catch murderers, to find kidnapped children, to stop terrorist attacks. Those are the claims they're going to make, that it's about investigations and public safety. But on another hand, it is about control. It is about societal control. And I think when people look at what's going on with China, with all the face recognition, with all of the dense camera systems, with all of the social credit scores, this is not about public safety. It is about control. It is about a ruling party trying to shape everyone in the image of the party. And so that's what I want. One of the things I'm very cognizant to try to fight against in the United States is not to build up the infrastructure that would allow the government to control us.
Well, I started to say that this is analogous to racial profiling, but I guess it is a version of racial profiling, because what you have, the argument for a certain kind of racial profiling, this kind of invasive surveillance of people, is that the more people you stop, the more likely you are to. There's a lot of, I think, in racial profiling, this is very clearly a police strategy. There are these pretext stops in which people are stopped just simply to be able to go through their things, and maybe then they find that they have drugs or a weapon or an outstanding warrant. And there needs to be a balance here, obviously, between safety and security, between crime and people's just personal civil rights to be able to walk around without constantly being under the scrutiny of law enforcement officers. But could you talk about how this relates to or is an extension of racial profiling?
Yes. So this happens in a lot of different ways. I think you're exactly right in that the more that the government collects data on certain populations, the more the algorithm is going to be biased toward those certain populations.
Right.
So, one of the technologies that we look at is something called predictive policing. And predictive policing is essentially software where law enforcement uploads all of their criminal justice information, where they responded to 911 calls, where a store is being robbed, where they, catching drunk drivers. They're just uploading all of this data to this algorithm. And this algorithm, which is not open to inspection by anybody, it's just this black box, starts making decisions either about neighborhoods or about people. And with neighborhoods, it'll say, well, we think that there is going to be, a crime here in this neighborhood at this time. So you should start sending patrol vehicles to this neighborhood at this time. But if those patrol vehicles are going to that neighborhood, they're collecting more data on the neighborhood. They're collecting more license plate reader data. They're doing more police stops. And then that's feeding into the system. And then the system is like, oh, well, we have more data onto that neighborhood, so we're going to tell police to go there more often. But you also get systems where the idea is that it mines all the data and it decides who is most connected to crime, who is most likely to be committing crime, and then tell police to start investigating them. And that is just incredibly racist because we have a problem. We have, decades, if not, centuries of police, over-policing of Black people in America. And so that means there's more data on Black people in America in these systems. And that means it's definitely going to start pushing algorithms in the direction of Black people or Hispanic people or other, traditionally over-policed minority groups. What makes it worse is that some of these technologies, like particularly face recognition. So infamously, face recognition is built, by tech companies, and these tech companies are overwhelmingly controlled by and hire, white men. And so white men build these technologies with all the assumptions of being a white male in U.S. society. And as a result, these technologies make a lot more mistakes with Black skin and Black faces and women and other groups. And that can result in, and has resulted in innocent people being identified by face recognition when it wasn't them, just because the algorithms are wrong. But in addition to that, there's just this, it just enhances the inherent racism already existing in police. I often get asked by journalists, how do we know that these algorithms are racist? Do I have any statistics about this? And one of the problems is that law enforcement just isn't keeping track. Like they're not keeping statistics that would allow us to do that kind of analysis. And so what I point to instead is examples like the New York Police Department's PowerPoint presentation on how to do face recognition. And if you bring up that PowerPoint presentation, and you look at all of the examples, it's like a dozen examples of Black men, one example of a white person, and one example of like a Hispanic person. And I'm like, if that's how they're training people, everyone who sits down and gets that training, whether they're consciously or not, is going to associate face recognition as a tool for, arresting Black citizens in our society. Or they look at it and this is just the fact of the data that exists already. They didn't have other examples of white people to include because they are engaging in racist policing. It's hard to know why this presentation ended up the way it did. But to me, I opened it and it was a stark reminder that there's a lot of cultural insensitivity in law enforcement and a lot of tone deafness. And law enforcement just isn't reconciling the use of technology and how it may impact, marginalized and targeted communities.
Well, it's ironic because at the same time that they're giving implicit association tests on racism, they're using this kinds of presentations that themselves are a perfect example of it. Is that publicly available, what you're mentioning there?
Oh, yeah. This is a lot of the information we have about law enforcement technology is based on Freedom of Information Act requests, which, I know you probably have some international listeners who aren't familiar with this. And so in the United States, as well as in a lot of other countries, there's a similar law in Japan. There's a similar law in Britain. There's a lot of nations that have these laws. But in the U.S., it is the ability either on the state level or the local level or on the federal level to, write down on a piece of paper or in an email that you want documents about a specific thing, and the government has to hand those documents over to you. So, for example, with face recognition, I believe it was an organization, I think it was Georgetown University researchers who had filed a public records request with NYPD for presentations and other training materials and contracts related to face recognition. And that was one of the documents that NYPD handed over. And it's just online on the internet. I would give a plug for the big project that we're working on here at EFF, which is called the Atlas of Surveillance. And it is a map and a database of the United States that we're building. And it currently has more than 5,500 individual data points showing what police departments have what technology. So if you're in Cleveland or you're in Cincinnati or you're in Albuquerque or Tulsa, you can type it. You can either zoom in on your place on the map, or you can put it into the text search and it'll tell you all the different technologies that we found in that area, along with links to news articles or press releases or academic papers that document evidence for the information that we found.
Let's go back to the issue of racial profiling for a minute and just maybe expand outward from there. You've already made this point to some extent in the sense of the way police are using technology for these purposes, but what critique would you make of this kind of technology? I'm thinking in particular Bill Bratton and Raymond Kelly in New York City with ComStat and compiling statistics, and there is a certain logic to it, right? So what I wonder is, what do you think the best critique of racial profiling could be? And how would you respond to people who are saying that they're just, doing pragmatically what is useful and it may have obvious racial or other connotations to it, but as a matter of fact, this is the most efficient way for police to go about their job?
So, I would take issue with the conclusion that the way policing has been going for the last 100 years is actually like an unbiased, unracially, motivated system. Like, I just think that premise is not supported by history at all. So, what we're talking about is a trajectory of the development of data-based journalism or data-driven, not journalism, but data-driven policing in the United States and beyond. But like when you look at like early NYPD stuff, and I have a colleague who's done some research papers about the early history of the NYPD. But NYPD, they're using face recognition now, but 100 years ago, they were collecting head measurements and skull measurements of arrestees and then claiming that something about somebody's head shape meant that they were more disposed to criminality. which is just not biologically supported and is incredibly racist. And looking at that in, you look back at it now and you're like, this is just disgusting. Like this is, police are not scientists. There is no science here. They are just doing non-evidence-based policing that is resulting in persecuting or giving an excuse to persecute Jews or Italians or Irishmen or whatever the population that they were scapegoating at the time. What we have now is not that much different. They're just applying technology to it and having this, instead of there being some analyst in the police department who's making these decisions, they have a computer software that's making these decisions. And they like to believe that because it's software, it doesn't have bias, but it definitely does. And, to wrap it all around back to where this skull-based research of policing, you have companies now who are coming back and saying, we have an algorithm that can predict like a terrorist based on their head shape, or we can predict somebody is likely to commit a crime because of the way they express their faces. Their facial expressions, or we could put microphones into a school campus and that will detect, when somebody is being aggressive on campus. But all of these are based on are often based on the cultural assumption that being white and male and European is good or law-abiding, and anything that strays from the status quo is not. In the case of like these, I mentioned aggression detection. Like this is there's several companies actually that go and try to sell to in the wake of school shootings, have tried to sell to universities these technologies that are designed to identify when somebody is yelling or acting aggressively, whatnot. But you can imagine that people across different cultures communicate differently. There is no standard way to communicate. What may sound as I lived in Japan for a bit, and, my general way of talking as an American is not how people communicate in Japan, and is often interpreted as loud and aggressive and obnoxious. And so you can't have an algorithm really make these accurate decisions because it's so culturally specific. But, ProPublica, the investigative journalism outfit in, here in the US, got a hold of some of these devices and started testing them, with students. And sure enough, if the students were doing a chant for "We want ice cream," it would set off the aggression detector. If they were playing Pictionary in class, it would set off the aggression detector. Right. They played a clip of comedian Gilbert Gottfried, who many of you know played the parrot in Aladdin, Disney's Aladdin. They played a comedy sketch of him, and it set off the aggression detector. Yeah, so like this science is just junk science. It's just snake oil, but yet it's marketed so well by these companies, and law enforcement is so, dazzled by these miracle cures that they go ahead and purchase it.
Well, what I take from this, and it's a rather obvious point, that policing always reflects the biases and assumptions of the police and the culture in which it's practiced. And that even though today, obviously, we have different kinds of technology and as a result, different kinds of policing, in any era in American society, you're going to see that biasing, there's racial biases directed towards certain populations. You know the work, surely, of Michelle Alexander, the book, The New Jim Crow, where she makes the argument that even though the legal system of Jim Crow had been eradicated by the mid to late 60s, in fact, the new Jim Crow continues, and just in another form. There are more people incarcerated in the United States than in any country in the world, and something like 1/3 of all young Black men will have some serious encounter with the criminal justice system. So is that aspect? Obviously, this isn't just racial, though. Are there other forms of discriminatory practices that you're seeing within this use of technology?
Sure. So your point about how so many, Black men in the United States end up having an interaction with law enforcement, or at least, temporary incarceration, if not full imprisonment. You have to realize that any time that somebody is arrested in the United States, data is collected on them. In fact, anytime they're stopped by a police officer, data is collected on them. Right. And so every interaction, you have to view it as a data collection point. So, during a police stop, The officer is going to be marking down who they met with, what color they are, whether they suspected them being a member of a gang, that kind of information. And in Los Angeles, there was a whole bunch of cops who were caught falsely saying that people were members of gangs and adding them to these gang databases because they didn't want to seem like they needed an excuse to pull over people of color. And they, if they pulled them over for just being black, that doesn't work. But pulling them over and saying, well, this is a gang member does. But so that is at the traffic stop level, like the roadside level. But you get somebody into jail, that's when you start seeing fingerprinting, face recognition, like the images you need for face recognition, DNA collection, everything along those lines, ends up getting fed into the system. So you have that as one element where we're seeing the data collected in a discriminatory way. Another way is in the bail system. We, it's long been the case that the juries and judges have assigned punishments differently to black defendants than white defendants, even if it is a similar crime. But what we're also seeing is that algorithms, that are supposed to be unbiased, will just give they'll do these things called risk assessments where they make a recommendation whether somebody should be given bail or not. And frequently they're also biased because of that information that has been flowing into the system. They're biased. And again, we'll say that, white people who committed the same crime should be able to go free with a low bail. And a black person who did the same crime should stay behind bars with no bail or an impossible to meet bail system. Another element that I like that was brought to my attention a few years ago and really shifted a lot of my thinking on privacy issues is the social welfare system in the United States. That if you are someone who is poor, who relies on food stamps or other kinds of assistance, the state will require you to give up just so much of your privacy. They will require you to hand over, information about every facet of your life. Caseworkers are allowed to come to your house and inspect your house whenever you want. They are going to be, people will be using license plate reader, searching your license plate through the license plate reader database all the time to make sure that you're not, if you're collecting unemployment, that you're not actually going to a job every day. Like there's just so much invasiveness. And because there are these, systemic inequalities in our society where people of color just don't have the economic resources or the economic opportunities, they're getting a different treatment by the government. You look at like white communities or affluent communities in the United States who talk about, we need to be left alone by government. Government should get out of my business. I should be allowed to own a gun if I want to. I should be allowed to do this other thing if I want to. And that's coming from a real sense of privilege because on the other hand, people who are poor, they don't get to say, I want the government out of my life. They don't get to say like, I have a right to be left alone because they're poor and they just don't have those opportunities and they are relying on assistance. So I don't know. I think that is some of the areas of bias we're seeing in technology and privacy in our society. But it's really hard to briefly encapsulate it as all encapsulate all the different things that are going on because every time I pick up the newspaper, there is a new inequality going on there. There's a new bias. There's something that makes my jaw drop, and just every day it just seems to be getting worse and worse.
You've given some examples. Can you give some more examples of that? Because I think for me, what's really interesting in talking to you is just how incredibly complicated and multifaceted all of this is. It just seems like every aspect of our lives is being taken over by this. So you were mentioning that poor people and people of color, they may be under a great deal of scrutiny that's actionable in the sense that the police are going after them. But everyone right now, in any public encounter they have, and anytime they get in the media, that information is conceivably being compiled. So it feels like every aspect of our life has been taken over by this. How do you map this?
It's just so hard. One of my roles at EFF is to work in trying to identify how surveillance targets marginalized communities or vulnerable communities. One of the things that we see a lot, one of my colleagues works on investigating something that she calls Stalkerware. These are software applications that domestic abusers use to spy on their exes. So, or on their current partners. So the idea is that you have a controlling, abusive husband, and the husband wants to know everything that his wife is doing at any time. So secretly installs an app on their phone or their computer that just feeds everything to them. You might see something similar with stalkers or ex-partners who are trying to, use this to abuse them. And this is something that obviously in our society is disproportionately affects women, and is the perpetrators are almost always men. Now the victims aren't always men, because you do find that in the LGBTQ community, men, there will be male abusers who are doing the same thing against their same-sex partners. But it is it's very rare to see that the perpetrator is a woman. And I think that when you have industry that is overwhelmingly controlled by men, there's a blind spot to the way that the technology impacts people who are not white men.
Well, is this outside the purview of law enforcement agencies? Is this all legal?
So it's interesting. So this is not law enforcement. This is just me giving another example of technology. But I would say that one of the things that I research is how rogue cops abuse these technologies. And that is something that we frequently see, where cops are going into databases to gather information about their ex-partners, or to gather information about somebody that they're obsessed with. There's a case in San Diego, California, a prison guard or a sheriff's deputy. A sheriff's deputy had, while in plainclothes, had groped a minor at a convenience store. And then he went back, because this victim had, called the police and said, somebody groped me. And he was able to access the entire database and look up information about the victim, look up information about the case. And it was really horrendous. And we see that quite a lot, where police are abusing these systems for personal gain. And so that's kind of where one of the intersections is.
David, do you see any appropriate use of this technology? What are the boundaries? What are the parameters in which there's an appropriate use of this technology, not only for law enforcement, but just information gathering? I mean, I very much respect your organization and your work dealing with civil rights issues, because there's such widespread abuse about this, and the implications are so profound on people's, freedom. But under what conditions, under what parameters would all this be not only acceptable, but maybe even desirable?
So one of the frameworks that we advocate is something called community control over police surveillance. The ACLU gave it the acronym CCOPS, CCOPS. And this is a concept that law enforcement should not be able to unilaterally acquire surveillance technology. That when a police department wants to purchase something, say license plate readers or drones or face recognition, there's a public process that has to happen. And the first stage of that process is that law enforcement needs to do a privacy assessment. They need to say, what are the risks of this technology and how are we going to mitigate these risks? They have to go through what kind of data will be collected and how will they use it. And then they need to write a policy. What are the protocols for using this technology? They have to propose what kind of crimes, what kind of training, go through and actually articulate how they're going to, the rules for using the technology. And then they need to take that to an elected body. So usually with a police department, this is going to be the city council. So a police department wants face recognition. They're going to write out what the risks are, how they're going to mitigate the risks. They're going to write down what their policy is, and then that's going to go to the city council. And then the city council is going to have a public hearing where they hear from members of the community about what their concerns are. They're going to find out if people actually want this community and this technology in their community. And then they have the ability to either veto the purchase or to require the police department to strengthen its policy and have more safeguards involved. And then, if the city council decides to allow the technology into the community, then the police department has to come back every year or every 2 years and explain how it was used and whether it was effective. And then if there was a data breach, it needs to disclose that. If it was abused, they need to disclose that. But really, we're talking about good governance here, in that should be a full and thorough process for adopting this technology. And if at the end of that process, a community decides that based on the public safety threat, they have a necessary and proportionate need for that technology, then maybe they should go for it. And that's actually that term necessary and proportionate. That is a term adopted by many international NGOs for how surveillance should be, how nations should make decisions about surveillance. only use surveillance that, as necessary and in proportionate response to the threat. So you don't need to if you're trying to deal with jaywalking, you don't need to build an entire surveillance network that is doing face recognition and monitoring people's phones and that kind of thing. It's a low-level crime. It doesn't have that much of a harm on people. You don't need to violate everyone's civil rights all the time. Now, on the other side of things, you have, let's say you have a credible tip that a bomb is going to go off at a particular event at a particular time, and that what you need is to get somebody on the ground immediately who has the ability to gather information on the phones of everyone there, then maybe that is reasonably like a proportionate and necessary use of the technology. Surely there should be some accountability mechanism so you can't do that all of the time, and there should be some disclosure after the fact. But I think that a lot of people would agree that it's necessary in proportion. And that balancing test, there's not like a bright line rule. It has to go through a process, and people have to come to compromise and agreement on it. But that's where I would land it. But that said, I would say that nobody should be using face recognition. I don't think that, it's okay to use face recognition to unlock your iPhone, but I think that this technology is so tainted and so dangerous and so flawed that no law enforcement agent should be using face recognition technology.
Well, I want to return to that in a moment, but I think some of the issues that you've raised there are really interesting because it's anticipatory, it's preemptively taking actions to develop what might be called a regulatory process. I'm thinking that this is somewhat analogous to war in the case of the proportionate use of force and under what conditions certain kind of actions can be taken. How do we get to this point? Is this because we've essentially had what is a kind of public warfare between the police and the communities that they're enforcing their actions on, and as a result, in the kickback, you're starting to get people who are trying to, in front of all this, develop actions and protocols and parameters instead of after the fact? I guess that through the Freedom of Information Act, disclosures, through public court cases, through just media disclosure, after the fact, you have calls for reform. But what you're talking about is building a regulatory system, putting that in place, and having the public involved in decision-making instead of having this behind the veil of public security in which the police are the only people who have a say in how this stuff is implemented.
Yeah. So, so I want to tweak the assumption there. So the thing that you mentioned is that the police are, making these decisions, and they're the only ones making these decisions. And I would actually classify it as decisions about surveillance are actually being made between the companies selling the technology and police. There's this complicity here. I think that there's this, back in the first half of the 20th century, there was this military official, Smedley. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. I think it was like General Smedley had written this book called War is a Racket that talked about how, companies that make weapons of war are essentially just profiting off of it. And that's how war is perpetuated. And I think that what we're looking at now is surveillance as a racket, that you have tech companies that are promoting, that it is in their interest to have the surveillance state grow because they're going to make money off of it. And there are these inappropriate relationships between police departments and these companies that result in these technologies being adopted. A really good example is Amazon. Amazon, has various law enforcement products, including one called Ring. Ring are these doorbell cameras. Like they sell this consumer electronics to members of the community, and they say, well, if you put this camera on your front door and it's got like a doorbell button, you can see everybody coming to your front door. You can gather information on, you can stop your packages from being stolen, et cetera, et cetera. And that is this, what we call a public-private partnership, because it gets local people to install their private cameras, but then Ring brokers these agreements with law enforcement where law enforcement can get access to the footage from these cameras. Sometimes it's by requesting the footage, but there's some complications in there that I won't get into. But what we've seen is that every year there are these police conferences where police chiefs and purchasing officers go, where they are just lavished with perks by these companies. So I went to one of these conferences once, and Amazon had sponsored a relaxation zone for police chiefs, where police chiefs could get free food and free massages. Now, I think most people in a community do not get to give the police chief a massage before they make a decision about surveillance, but Amazon does. And that's like a funny example, but it gets like worse, because at these conferences, so at the one I went to, Amazon's subsidiary Ring threw a party. And at this party it was headlined by Shaquille O'Neal, the famous basketball player. He was like the host because he's an investor in the company, I guess. But every police chief was invited to this with an invite said, come to our party, you'll get free drinks, free food, and if you come, you will get 5 free Ring cameras to take home. Those Ring cameras, 5 Ring cameras is about $1,200 worth of free electronics. Wow. So you can see photos on Twitter of this event, because cops are like tweeting pictures themselves at it. It was a packed room. And these are cops from all over the country. And if you look at this and you think every one of these cops was given free food, free booze, and $1,500 or $1,200 worth of equipment, how is that on the up and up? How is that, a police department being able to make an objective decision about that technology? They can't. And you can look like directly, that event happened, and then you can look at individual people who are at the event, and you can look at how months later their police departments signed an agreement with Ring to promote Ring's product, to promote people in the community signing up and purchasing rings. And then you have police giving out discount codes. You have Ring writing press releases for the police departments, writing social media like content for the police department to post on the official police department Facebook page. It's just a nightmare of like this weird kind of fuzzy corruption. Like, where is the line between, a perk and a bribe? Where is the line between, normal vendor relationship and kickback? It's really hard to tell. But what I can say, absolutely, is that this is an imbalance that does not that does not put the community first.
Well, aside from revealing this situation, which is what your organization has done, how do you stop this? I mean, in some ways, this is just essentially the free market at work. There's a market mechanism here. It's a good business practice, I guess, from the point of view of Amazon or Facebook or these organizations that use these strategies to be able to, benefit themselves. But under what conditions would you be able to, for lack of a better word, police this? How can you prevent this from happening? You're talking about what essentially is a kind of civil society-based regulatory process in which people are able to have some say in the authorities who have the control over their lives. But aside from an organization like yours, which in some ways is kind of a watchdog organization, or with legal cases after the fact, how can you put a system in place to prevent this to begin with?
So, I mean, we are seeing a lot of movement with, cities and counties passing these community control over police surveillance ordinances. So here in the Bay Area, San Francisco has one, as well as a face recognition ban in San Francisco. Santa Cruz just passed an ordinance like this, along with a predictive policing and a face recognition ban. Berkeley, Oakland, Davis in California all have CCOPS ordinances. In San Diego, they're about to pass, or at least they're getting very close to passing one of these ordinances. We said several cities in the Boston area pass ordinances like this. We're seeing it in Seattle. We're seeing it in places in the Midwest. So this is a movement that, even to my delight but surprise, is actually growing and actually taking off.
Many of the cases that you mentioned there are California, Boston. I would anticipate that those are kind of liberal enclaves. But you mentioned you're seeing it in the Midwest. Are you seeing it in places like, Alabama or North Carolina, or the reddest of the red states, where people have a very different view of authority, a very different view of the police, sometimes very much a militarist culture, and also, at the dead center of Trump land?
So I would challenge that assumption. So what we've seen over the years is that, states like Nebraska and Nevada and Arizona, states that, are either traditionally red or have leaned that way. Mm-hmm. Have been among the first to pass reforms around surveillance. You talk to people in Nebraska, and they are very libertarian there. They have,
right.
They have restrictions on license plate readers and, these things called cell site simulators, which are fake cell phone towers. When I have pursued legislation about these technologies, I definitely see bipartisan support. A few years ago, we tried to pass a bill related to license plate readers. It ultimately failed, but my two sponsors were somebody widely regarded as the furthest left of the left in the left of San Francisco, like a lifelong Democrat, progressive who represented the city where I live. And the other sponsor was potentially the rightest of the right of the right of Southern California. I think the other sponsor had actually been Donald Trump's California campaign co-chair. What we're able to see is this combination of the left and the right coming together. It is really the challenge are the folks who are kind of moderates in the middle, who are catering to the status quo and not necessarily having a strong ideology one way or another. I tend to say that if you are someone who believes in something, if you believe in something, if you have a philosophy or a cause or a political position, then you care about surveillance. And it doesn't, surveillance doesn't distinguish between whether you're a conservative or a progressive. It doesn't. What it does do is, if you are someone who just doesn't necessarily believe in anything, or you don't have strong commitments to dissent, and really all you want to do is keep things the way they are and support the institution of government, then that's the sort of folks that are going to be promoting the surveillance state. One of the interesting things, just to give you an example, Texas banned red light cameras. Which, for people who aren't familiar with that, these are cameras put on stoplights to catch people who are, in the intersection when the intersection turns red. This is a controversial technology in the United States because depending, it is an automated technology. It is a technology that gathers data on people. People have somewhat, they've been normalized in society to an extent, but there really are some consequences to it. If you have it, they make mistakes frequently. They can be placed in neighborhoods disproportionately, depending on how you set how long your yellow light is. It can result in, more people being caught by the camera versus less. For some police departments, this is really more of a money generating process than anything else. But Texas banned it. They banned it. This very classically red state banned a technology that police love, but they felt was a bad use of technology, was privacy invasive, and avoided due process. And so I challenge the assumption that this is a red-blue thing. Certainly, there are different concerns in metropolitan areas than in rural areas. But when it comes down to it, when we're going to Congress or members of Congress are calling me, I get as many calls from Senator Wyden, a progressive Democrat's office, as I do from Rand Paul, a Libertarian Republican's office. So it really doesn't break along those lines.
Well, would this be some solution to the partisan divide in the United States? Because what you're saying here is that people who are both promoting and trying to protect their interests are very much aware of this and they're engaging. And the middle, the moderates who are maybe less politically engaged, maybe they don't necessarily support what we could call the security state, but they just are compliant and passive with regard to it. Is this an avenue or a way in which we could start to bridge the partisan divide, in which people start seeing the state as problematic? Because I know I'm betraying my liberal bias here, but it seems like conservatives are at cross purposes here, because on the one hand, they're very much against restrictions on police practices, except to the point where it starts to affect them personally. And, race is very much involved in this picture because the racial profiling, the Black Lives Matter movement, the protests that have broken out around that, red states and conservative media have been very much opposed to that. But at the same time, when you look at Trump, part of Trump's deal is about a distrust of what they would call the deep state, or maybe you could call the surveillance state. But, Trump's antagonism and war with the intelligence communities, surely that's one of the reasons why he's appealing to some libertarians. But back to my original question, is there any way of maybe strategically using this as a way to bridge that partisan divide around people who have a common interest and freedom from this invasive surveillance?
So if you'd asked me 3 years ago, prior to the 2016 election, I would have said yes. I would have said that we are seeing a lot more collaboration around these issues. Things have become a lot more divided over the last few years. Congress is just not getting as much done. We have seen a lot of this happen on the state house level. So, we have seen a lot of collaboration, or at least some collaboration on the state level. But it's hard, though, because as you pointed out, we're in a era of uncertainty and fog, and on one hand you'll have in the same breath you'll have Donald Trump talk about how he supports police, and the police love him and he's great for the police, but in the same breath he'll say that the FBI is corrupt and incompetent and you can't trust them at all. And these are not reconcilable ideas. FBI is law enforcement. Police are law enforcement. If you're trying to discredit law enforcement, how do you discredit law enforcement while promoting it? And I think that it's difficult for the media. It's difficult for his supporters. It's difficult for everybody to comprehend what is going on and what positions to take. And so I feel like not as optimistic as I was in previous years related to this, but also it's really unclear to know what the political breakdown of society is these days, because is it Democrats and Republicans, or is it Democrats, Republicans, and something else? As the election moves on, and I have to be clear, as a 501c3, EFF does not get involved in election issues at all. Like, I don't take a position on who should be elected or not be elected, and we can't actually take a position on that. So I'm just commenting here on observations and where we try to operate. But, you look and you see that that you have some Republicans who are fiercely defend the president. But now you see a flood of Republicans who are either abandoning the party or who have endorsed the Democrat. And it's hard to really figure out what's going on here. Is this two groups? Is this three groups? Is it four groups? Like, being in San Francisco, you find that a large number of the population feels like Nancy Pelosi, might as well be a Republican. But if you're looking at the rhetoric out of the Republicans, Nancy Pelosi is the furthest left as you possibly could get. And so it's really like this absurd time where categorizing things has just become impossible. And so it does make it difficult to operate. It does make it difficult to try to make, political arguments about any issue, be it the environment, be it healthcare, or be it surveillance.
We've neglected to talk about this up to this point, but right now the United States is maybe facing the worst experience with this global pandemic of any country. And it's a country that's not testing very comprehensively, in which Trump has come out and really even quite literally said to slow down the testing under the inane conclusion that by testing you're going to find new cases. But I would think that when I look at countries, I live in Japan. You look at countries that have done pretty well with the virus. You have South Korea, Vietnam, Singapore, Thailand, Japan. They've all done really quite well in terms of their case counts. And they are societies that are somewhat authoritarian. They have no qualms about doing contact tracing and being invasive on people's privacy as a way to try to challenge this virus. So what will your take be on the public health implications of this kind of mass surveillance and ways in which it might be able to be used to our common advantage, but by the same token, obviously, that's subject to abuse?
So, earlier in the conversation, you mentioned how, a lot of people have noted that 9/11 was like a pivotal point in American history and in global history, and that it just changed how, the world viewed surveillance, as well as many other things in our society. But since we're talking about surveillance, and I think 2020 is on par with that, and may historically prove to even have been a more pivotal point in our society. And the reason is we have the pandemic. And the pandemic is, there's a lot of people who are trying to, as we put it, nerd their way out of the pandemic, come up with miracle technologies that will solve the pandemic. But meanwhile, we also have this huge movement about police reform and police brutalities and reconciling long-standing race issues in society. And so you have those two things happening at the same time that I don't think we're going to emerge from 2020, the same nation and with the same kind of discourses we're having before. But then on top of that, we have, this election coming up, which could fundamentally change things. And, we have a whole, series of concurrent environmental crises in the United States as well. So this year is a year where people are thinking about in new ways, like an overhaul of the paradigm about surveillance technology. Like, what are people willing to accept in order to stop the pandemic? What are people willing to get rid of in order to address racial inequality? And so it's weird in that regard, and I don't know where we're going to come out on the other end of it. But I can answer your question about how we feel about the technology growing, if that helps.
Yeah, well, I mean, one point that I just wanted to make there is I don't know if it's a matter of people necessarily feeling like they're going to be able to stop this as much as they've just become much more aware of it when we have police cameras that reveal these outrageous acts of brutality by the police. I don't know, maybe I'm cynical, maybe somewhat fatalistic in the sense that to the extent there is a surveillance state, if that's even the appropriate label for it, doesn't it plow ahead unabated by what the public thinks about it? Is it possible that we can really get a handle on this and be able to use this for a positive social good rather than, these kind of exploitative purposes that we've been seeing?
I mean, possibly, but with controls and with consent. So when we look at all of these apps and digital contact tracing systems that are being proposed, our baseline requirement here is that people have to consent to be part of it, that you can't force it upon people. And what's interesting is that, to go back to an earlier question about the politics and lawmakers related to this, one of the changes over the last, maybe 5 to 10 years is that for the first time, people who understand technology are being elected to office. It used to be so frustrating to try to explain all of these issues to people who just didn't know how the internet works. But now you have technologists who are, people who have backgrounds in either business technology or actually are computer scientists themselves who are elected to office who really understand the nuance of it. And so one of the really comforting things is that we are seeing, as legislators and other policymakers are looking at these apps and these solutions, they're thinking about the privacy implications going in and the privacy protections that can be baked into the system, as opposed to what was in the past is that you just adopt the technology, wait for there to be problems, and then you try to solve them. I am not convinced that technology is going to get us out of the pandemic in the United States through contact tracing or anything like that. I mean, I'm not an epidemiologist, and so I don't want to claim that I know what the solution is and what's going to work. But I would also point out that nobody knows what's going to work. We've never dealt with this before. All these companies are trying to come up with new technologies to deal with it. All of them are untested. It is just a live experiment on society.
I think in some ways we overthink this. I mean, living in a country where something does seem to work. I mean, I'm seeing in Thailand, I have friends who live in Bangkok. Thailand experienced its first case in 100 days. It has a total of about 500 people have died out of a total 3,000 cases that have been identified. Of course, there are a lot of people who are asymptomatic, but it seems that, I don't know if it's all that complicated. Wear a mask, social distance, have hygiene, and also think about comorbidity in terms of your immune system and your health. Some 40% of Americans are overweight. Some 3% of Japanese are obese. And that may be all we need to know about why there's been such a disproportionate impact. But I wonder if that in the West, people are going through all these contortions to try to come up with some genius solution, as you mentioned, to kind of nerd the way out of this pandemic, when in fact, it's not all that complicated. We know what works, which is just transmission happens through interpersonal connection. It happens through a respiratory tract. And, if you practice social distancing and wear a mask, then that does seem to work. I don't know that it's all that complicated. It's just that in the United States, you can't get people to follow the rules.
I think you might be right there. I think there's probably a few other factors in there. And I'm just hypothesizing here because I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not an infectious disease expert. But I would suggest that when we're looking at a lot of the countries you mentioned, they have a much more homogenous population and culture. Whereas we're dealing with the United States, we have a lot of diversity in cultures and a lot of diversity in,
high context versus low context cultures. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's that. But I would also say that countries in Asia had to deal with SARS and other pandemics in the past, and we never had that kind of reconciliation. We never had to build that up. So there's that too. But I would also say that there's probably an element of the constant reliance on social media for our news, essentially the news and information ecosystem in the U.S. In that, and I can't speak to the news information ecosystem in Japan and Taiwan, but I can say that there's a massive amount of misinformation out there. That the way that social media has been adopted into U.S. society is designed to, maybe it's not designed to, but it has the consequence that anger-provoking, fear-provoking content is more popular, and that people are being told, you can look at what I'm seeing through my channels is exactly what you said. It seems like, if everyone's wearing a mask and people are social distancing and you're washing your hands and you're not being dumb with where you're going out, we can get this under control. But other people are saying on social media and the news that masks maybe don't do anything, that there's, these miracle drugs that will protect you. Or, on the worst end of the spectrum, are trying to convince people that deaths are okay. That we don't have to care about other people because we're the ones who are strong and going to survive it. And that's all very daunting, and there's not a real easy way to deal with that. So I know the social media companies are really struggling to try to figure out how to deal with disinformation and this, seemingly cultural shift where certain populations don't care about, the deaths of others. But, I would distinguish between those two. There are many different factors going on in the United States that aren't happening elsewhere.
Yeah, it's hard to make those comparisons. As is often the case, it's usually not very meaningful to make comparisons between Japan and the United States or other Western countries. The better comparisons are more nuanced by comparing Japan to other Southeast Asian countries because they have much more in common in all sorts of ways. But
when I visited, recently, and we were having discussions about surveillance in Tokyo, the relationship between people and police is just so very different in Japan. Here you would never have a culture where there's a neighborhood police officer who comes and knocks on your door and walks in and sits in your foyer, and then you have a good conversation with them. That just would never happen here. You would never have a situation where a cop could walk into your front door.
Well, we've gotten to that point. There's a criminologist who's an expert on Japan named Daniel Foote. He calls this benign authoritarianism, and that the police, they're not entirely kind in all their interactions, but there is this community-based policing, which in some ways was considered to be a model for law enforcement in the United States. Never quite were able to implement it, but the Koban system, where people are literally only a block away from police. But there's all sorts of issues here that are obviously so different. You don't have the militarization of the police here in the same way, but you also don't have the level of interpersonal violence. You don't have the same level of crime. You don't have the socioeconomic differences that might provoke that. So it's hard to make one-to-one comparisons on that. But yeah, ironically, I think in Japan it's a different kind of surveillance. It's kind of a peer-based public surveillance in the sense that there's mutual accountability among the people. And you really feel this. When I go out into the city and I see people jogging wearing masks, you'll see people driving in a car by themselves wearing a mask. You know that these are people who've really internalized that as a priority in the United States.
I would say that Japan really did have a leg up on everyone else in the pandemic because masks have been normalized for decades. You're sick, you wear a mask, or if you've got a cold sore, maybe you wear a mask. It's not outside the norm.
Yeah, but there's a very different relationship to authority, and subsequently a very different relationship between the police. It's going to be very interesting to see the Olympics because if and when the Olympics come to Japan, the state's going to have a very strong interest in public surveillance for anti-terrorist activities. And also, this could become invasive for public health reasons if they're going to be doing contact tracing and trying to identify clusters to enable the Olympics to move forward. If in the Olympic Village or cluster of administrators or staff break out with the virus, then like you've seen in the NBA or professional sports in the United States, they may try to do much more frequent testing and contact tracing. So it'll be really interesting to see how the long-term effect that will have, because as you've seen, I think it's pretty difficult to walk this stuff back after it's been implemented. And then if you look at the public's relationship to the police in the United States, particularly after the murder of George Floyd and the way the Black Lives Matter movement has amplified over the last number of years, the public is in a very different place than it was just a few years ago. Obviously, activists and people of color and people who had been subjected to this with more frequency were very much aware of this, but now it's become a public issue in ways that it hadn't otherwise. And there has been this debate, and it may be the defining issue of the upcoming election, the whole discourse on defunding the police. That's probably the least effective tagline you could ever have for a public policy, particularly among moderates or conservatives. But the reforming the police and having accountability for their behavior is certainly something that people are very much aware of.
Yeah. So, the issue of defunding the police, I think there's probably a certain sector who have shifted from messaging of abolish the police to defunding the police in just a term of like what is more effective or not effective messaging, or what messaging will reach the larger number of people.
Let's be clear with the terms here. Like, what do you take that whole notion of quote unquote defund the police to mean?
So I think that the idea is that on one level is that reforming the police isn't enough, that for years and years and years, people have talked about reforming the police, and the reforms that have been ushered in just have not worked. But what has happened is that police budgets have become, some of the most expensive part of a city budget or a county budget, that it's just taking so much away from other social services that it's important to redirect that money that will result in more public safety and more public health by not doing it on the policing side, but, kind of like in when you go to a doctor and there's a shift in medicine to, more holistically treat a person and to have them have a better healthy lifestyle rather than just giving them medicine when they're sick. And I think it's like a similar concept that perhaps if police are seen as the medicine when you're, to cure a sick society, maybe you could just make sure the society is being healthy to begin with, and then you need less policing. I think that's like one element, the way that people are seeing it. But it isn't like, it's definitely true that police have just been acquiring more and more money, and then that money has gone into reinforcing, mass incarceration and over-policing. I do believe we have an over-police society, that police are way too militarized and are not necessarily doing the things that they're doing to improve society all the time, but rather to enforce the power of policing. And that's not true for every police officer, not true for every police department, but I think as an institution in the United States, that is largely true. When it comes to surveillance technology is expensive. Like, it is not a cheap thing. And it often will cost millions of dollars. And then as a result, you can only point to like 5 or 6 crimes where it might have been effective or used. When you look at cities that, not necessarily because of a defund the police movement, but just because they had budget shortfalls due to the economy, when you have a place like Sacramento or Fresno, and I only use California examples because I'm in California, but both of those cities faced budget shortfalls. And so every department had to cut a percentage of its budget. And in both at Fresno and Sacramento, when those budget cuts came, the first thing they nixed were expensive surveillance systems that weren't delivering. And I think that's just important to note that as we're discussing defunding the police or decreasing police budgets, that surveillance is one of the least necessary things. These mass surveillance systems are among the least necessary, the most abused, and should be among the first things to go. I think other people who aren't necessarily working for a civil rights organization might say, well, we need less tasers, We need less cops on the street in general and more mental health support officers, more substance abuse support staff, and just taking other measures. I do think that there's probably like a thread of people in the United States who actually do want to overhaul policing to the extent that that the functions of policing are handed over to other kinds of professionals. I don't think that is the commonality across the United States. But I also am not, I'm looking at it through the lens of somebody in San Francisco and, to an extent as part of a bubble, but also through the lens of surveillance technology.
Well, I'm looking at it from a Pacific island, and America seems like more and more a foreign land to me the longer I've been here. I mean, it is truly bizarre and sad, to see the way public politics have developed there. I feel like I would be remiss as we're starting to wrap this up and kind of running out of time. You've been very generous with your time. How can people protect themselves against invasive surveillance, and what kind of recommendations do you have? I know you have an archive of resources with your organization, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. That's at EFF.org. You have compiled resources. You give lectures on this and are very knowledgeable on this. So, we've been talking about public institutions, about governments, about police, about intelligence agencies. But at the level of the individual consumer, the person who is using social media in their daily lives, what kind of steps do you think people should take to protect themselves against invasive and inappropriate public surveillance?
Yeah, so we do have a resource called Surveillance Self-Defense, ssd.eff.org, which has a range of resources of what you can do to lock down your devices or take other measures to protect your privacy. Now, there's always this balance here between what what you need to protect yourself and then what kind of inconveniences you're willing to go to protect those, to protect your privacy.
Yeah.
Well, I tend to sort of break it down though that if you're somebody who works in the national security space, or you are somebody who works in international intelligence issues, or likely to irritate the Russian government, then you're going to want to take different measures than what somebody who isn't engaged in those issues, like somebody who's just an everyday person who works in an office and comes home every night and watches TV. So some of the low level things that are the least inconvenient but the most impactful, I'm just going to go down a list of them. And probably the number one thing, if there was one thing that we want people to do, is just to make sure you install those security updates on your phone and your computer. It's kind of a pain to have to wait the 15 minutes for it to restart, but it's so important to do that. When Apple or Microsoft or whoever is telling you have to please install the security update, do it. The second thing that I would really encourage people to do is start using stronger passwords. Like, never reuse a password. Change them. If you ever get an alert that there's been a data breach, change that password immediately. But there's something called a password manager. This is a piece of software that allows you to remember just one really strong password and then have your software remember all of your other passwords, which allows you to have these really long, complicated passwords, but you don't have to memorize them or keep them like on a piece of paper on your desk. There's a bunch of different kinds of software that does that. Most computers come with either a default one, or if you buy an antivirus software, they will come with a default password manager. There's various other ones you can use, like 1Password or LastPass or KeePassX. Like, there's a variety of options. And I would say that actually ends up being, for me, way more convenient to just have to remember one password, but then it also it's much better for me to remember one password and then to feel comfortable that I have these other very strong, unique passwords kept in this manager. We have there's various ways for you to block websites from tracking you online. We have built a free plugin for Firefox and Chrome called Privacy Badger that you can download, that is going to block third parties from tracking your movement. So usually advertising companies or data brokers. And that could be really useful. Certainly for a lot of people, a VPN is super excellent. And that is, VPN means that you're not just browsing directly on the internet. You're going through a third, an external server that is serving as a kind of firewall for your data. When I was traveling through Japan, there are so many free internet networks that you can tap into as you're moving around the city or on a train, but you don't know who's watching your traffic on any of those, and you don't know who else could access it. Yeah, so using a VPN on those can be really beneficial.
So I don't know if you want to be quite specific on this, but you had mentioned password software, also VPN software. What do you use yourself, or what do you especially recommend?
EFF does not recommend specific products most of the time because that's just not our role,
Sure.
And we don't do huge evaluations. Yeah. However, I will say that typically we do use Signal as an encrypted messaging app. That is one of the primary ways that I communicate with people in the world, moving off of SMS text messaging to using Signal for many things.
Now, is that... But, in contrast to like WhatsApp or Line or messaging?
So, we haven't done a huge evaluation for all of these different secure messaging apps. There's lots out there. Just because I travel country to country, some apps are more popular to others. I do have WhatsApp also installed, and I use that to communicate with people who are more comfortable with WhatsApp. But I think that for a lot of people, the fact that WhatsApp is a Facebook product, regardless of how secure it is a turnoff for people, whereas Signal is run by a nonprofit, a very well-funded nonprofit, but that is an issue that a lot of people like to take into account. Another sort of tip that I want to throw out there is just encrypting all of your devices. If you have an iPhone, it automatically encrypts it. But with your desktop or laptop computers, you do need to go into your settings and turn on full disk encryption to make sure that your entire computer, if it leaves your hands, is stolen, or say the police sees it, that they can't as easily get into all of your files because they're encoded.
Which of the browsers do you, aside from Tor, which do you regard as being most secure?
I don't really have a judgment on that. And also, when it comes to software, there's a series of balances because secure and private aren't always the same thing, right? Like they can be different things. And then, there's also this idea of there's something philosophically and, better about open source technology or free software. And it just depends on, when you're making a choice about software, what's more important to you. Maybe all of those things are important to you, but not every browser, not every piece of software is going to meet secure, private, and open source evenly. So, I use, to give you an example, I use Google Docs for almost everything. Like I use it for spreadsheets. I don't use Microsoft Word or anything like that in Microsoft Office. I mostly do everything on Google Suite these days. Now, it's Google. Google does not have like a huge, a really great track record on privacy. It just doesn't. But it does have a very good track record on security because as the bajillion-dollar company that it is, it can employ the top security, engineers in the world and they can have a huge team of them and they can do lots of stuff to protect the security of the software.
Dave, this is a very naive question, but what's the difference between privacy and security?
Okay, so they're interwoven, but they're not always the same. So, for example, you might have so let's take the Google, Gmail or Google Suite. So with Google products, they are certainly tracking you to an extent. They're serving advertising on you. They have had a history of looking, having an algorithm look for your emails for things to advertise at you. They, just don't have a great record of privacy. However, it is very difficult for, say, somebody to, hack your Gmail accounts. Like, they can get your password if they if they're able to compromise your password through some other means, that's a totally different thing. But as far as just like breaking into Google, that's very hard. So while they maybe aren't fully respecting your privacy all of the time, it isn't like they have an insecure product. Now, you might have a different piece of software that doesn't collect any private information on you whatsoever and is totally private. But because they're not well funded, or because it's an open source, or because it's because they're not well funded, and because they're not a company as big as Google, maybe they're not able to employ all of the gigantic team of hundreds of engineers to really lock down the software and what's called test the software to make sure there aren't vulnerabilities. So like that's how I tend to explain it. I think other people might explain it a little bit differently. But ultimately you have to make a trade-off in some regard. So in that sort of three considerations, to what extent is it open source? To what extent is it private? To what extent is it secure? For some people, the open source element is going to be the number one thing, regardless of whether security or privacy, although open source technology tends to be more privacy protective. But it's just a personal decision. We have something called we talk about something called threat modeling, or risk assessment, which is like a thought exercise where you think about all of the data you have. What would, who would try to get it? What would be the worst thing that happened if somebody got it? And what are the trade-offs you're willing to make in order to protect it? And for some people, if you're like Edward Snowden, you are willing to just go through every possible inconvenience to lock it down because the risks are so high for you. But for other people, they don't need to use the Tor browser. They don't need to use PGP, emails. They don't need to go through all of these, very secure practices. I do take a lot of security practices, but that's because I work for, EFF and we make a lot of enemies. So, it's important to take that into consideration.
Well, as the saying goes, you will know them not just by their friends, but by their enemies. You're doing great work. It's really quite impressive, Dave. And for me, I feel some measure of pride that you're a graduate. If not a graduate, then you were a student at Temple University of Japan.
Oh, I'm a graduate of TUJ. I finished my degree there. So,
well, see, I have you in the category of study abroad student, but whereas
I transferred.
Many of our study abroads are only like one semester, junior year abroad. You were here for well over a year, right?
Oh yeah, no, I transferred. I transferred all my credits. Of interesting to your podcast listeners, but no, it was a great university, and I spent a few months there and decided that I did not want to go home. I wanted to continue with my education at TUJ.
Well, it's of interest to me, certainly. So, hey, I hope to see you back over here in Japan. Come for the Olympics like 3 years from now, or maybe next summer.
Fingers crossed we have a vaccine.
Yeah, it's been great talking to you, Dave. I really learned a lot. It's very thought-provoking. It's something that I'm going to read even more on. I feel like this is something that everyone needs to be more conversant on because it affects our lives in such profound ways. And I really respect the work you're doing. So thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, I'll be in touch by email and otherwise, but we'll sign out for now. Dave, thanks so much, man. Really appreciate it.
Hey, no problem. You have a good one and get some rest. I know it's really late there.
Yeah. Thanks for taking the time. I'll be in touch. Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye. This is Temple University Japan's ICAST through the Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. If you'd like more information and to see our previous archive of events, look to the ICAS website. And also we have an archive on YouTube with previous events. Thanks for joining us today.